These are the lies that sewists tell you, and maybe even a few that you might be telling yourself. Hi, my name is Sarah, and welcome to my channel, which is all about sewing and styling a handmade wardrobe. When people have been sewing for a while, they tend to develop really strong opinions about certain things like techniques, and they might be passing on that information as absolute truths. And I'm here to tell you that not everything is so black and white. So I'm going to be talking about a few of those things that come up in the sewing community that people just feel really strongly one way or the other. And I just want to debunk a few of those things and let you know that there are alternatives out there. And make sure that you watch to the end, because I'm going to be sharing a few submissions from you guys about what lies you think that sewists tell. Lie number 1. Your garments must have beautiful seam finishes on the inside in order to be considered good quality. Now, I have a little story to share about this, and I just want to put in a disclaimer that I am not advocating that you actually do this, but it's just more for illustrative purposes. So when I was a kid, my mom sewed a lot of my clothes for me, and she had learned to sew in high school in home ec class when they taught it back then. And apparently she was never taught how to finish her seams. She thought that the only way that you could finish seams was with a serger, and she didn't have one for a long time. She did eventually get one when I was a little bit older, but up until that point, she would sew all of my clothes and I would wear them and wash them, and she never finished the seams at all. She didn't do zigzags, she didn't do French seams, like none of that. They were just completely raw, even on woven fabrics. Now, obviously, those seams would fray in the wash and they would get more worn the more that I wore them, but probably because I was a child, I would outgrow things before they would fall apart. But I do have to say that even in those conditions, most of my clothes survived. It's not like they disintegrated after just 1 or 2 washes. So I feel like that just proves that even if your garment does not have beautiful, perfect finishes on the inside, then it will probably last you for a while, maybe not forever. And again, I'm not telling you to actually do this. I do think that you should finish your seams somehow if you want them to last. But I'm just saying that if you don't take the time to do it in the perfect way, that it's probably not the end of the world. I definitely go back and forth personally. A lot of it has to do with how I feel at the time or the type of garment that I'm making. If I'm making something like a jacket that I want to stay in my closet for years, then I might go the extra mile and do bound seams or do something that I think is going to be a really nice finish. But a lot of times I just feel like serging is fine and I don't really need to fuss about it. And I feel pretty confident that my garments are going to hold up in the wash just with serging. So don't let anyone tell you that you have to finish your seams using couture or high-end techniques or your garment's not any good. That's just not true. Lie number 2. Experienced sewists do not use a lot of pins. Now, honestly, this one was kind of a weird one to me. I was on a forum on Reddit and I was just reading through different things that people were talking about. And it was brought up that I guess certain people look down on others if they use a lot of pins, or they think that they're newbies and that they don't know what they're doing and that's why they use a lot of pins. And I just find that incredibly strange because I feel like you should use as many pins as you feel like. Maybe I was a little bit sensitive to this because I am an avid pinner. I put in lots and lots of pins. And I really think that it's just personal preference because you're going to have to do some manipulation of the fabric, and whether you want to do that beforehand by pinning or if you want to do it at the machine, either way is valid and either way can get you good results. So if you're someone who likes to do it before you get to the machine with lots of pins, I just don't think that that makes you a newbie or a bad sewist. So I don't even know if that's a common thing, if other people have heard that, but I say if you want to use a lot of pins, then go ahead. And if you don't want to use any pins, then go ahead. Either way is perfectly valid in my mind. It's just personal preference. Lie number 3 is that there is only one true way to do a skill. Now, I sort of get where people are coming from. Sometimes if you find a technique that really works for you and you're excited about it, you want to share and let other people know just in case they had previously been struggling. But there's a fine line between saying, hey, here's this new technique that I found and it's really great, versus this is the only way that you can do something. I feel like a recent example of this is the top-down, center-out method. It's been very popular, and I understand that people are excited about it because pants can be really difficult to fit. But I also think that there are lots of different ways that you can fit pants to your body, and this does not have to be the only way. And I'm actually getting a little bit scared now of people who start going on about the top-down, center-out method on Instagram or even on YouTube, because it starts to feel a little bit cult-like people think that there's no other way to do it. And I am here to say that is just not true. I don't use top down, center out. I did buy the Threads magazine with that article, and I did plan to try it initially, but also along the way, I've sort of stumbled on a method that seems to work for me, and it's like, why do I want to do something else when this works just fine? Maybe someday I will eventually try top down, center out just for science to see if it really works better or not than the method that I use. But in the meantime, I don't really see a reason to do it just because everyone else is and thinks that it's so wonderful. I say that there are always different ways out there to achieve the same result, and you should do whatever works best for you. So if anybody's out there trying to tell you that there's only one way to do something, they're just lying to you. Lie number 4 is this tool will magically solve all your problems. Now this is one that I need to take to heart because I have bought so many useless tools over the years, especially when I was a quilter. There are tons and tons of gadgets out there for quilting, and I have bought them all. And unfortunately, many of them over the years have ended up in a drawer and I never used them. So obviously this lie gets spread a lot because companies are trying to sell you something, and I'm here to tell you that that is not always the case. Sometimes there are tools that I feel are worth investing in if you do that particular skill a lot. It might be nice to have something that makes it a little bit easier and faster, but there's usually a low-key way to do something, and you don't always have to buy something new in order to get good results. One example that I can think of off the top of my head is this thing called a purple thing, and it's just a little tool that you can use to kind of as an extra finger almost when you're guiding something through your machine. And I'm not saying that it's a bad tool. I don't have one personally, but I know that people swear by them. But when I was a member of Craftsy Unlimited several years back now, I watched a ton of their classes, and they have lots and lots of different tips and tricks that you can learn. And one of the tips that I picked up from one of those classes is that you can just use a seam ripper as one of those tools. You don't really need to buy an extra purple thing to do that. And I do use my seam ripper in that way all the time. If I want to get really close to the needle, but I don't want to sew through my finger, I will use my seam ripper as a guide. And I think it works perfectly well, and I didn't have to fork over the whatever it was, $10 for the purple thing. And there's lots and lots of other examples out there of similar sorts of things that, yeah, maybe it could save you some time, so you have to decide for yourself if it's worth it. But I would maybe look around my sewing room first and see if there's anything that I already have that I could use instead and just save myself the money. Lie number 5 is that it is never okay to rehome your unsuccessful makes. Now this has never happened on my channel, but I've seen other YouTube videos where people talk about what they're clearing out of their wardrobes, and there have been people in the comments who are chastising the maker for getting rid of things that didn't work for them and saying that they're so wasteful. So I think that when we can, I think that it's good to try to refashion something or rework it or alter it in some way. But there are times when this just isn't feasible, or it's not something that you're in a good headspace to be able to do. Some examples of these things are maybe you've changed size, or maybe you just realized that this color doesn't work for you, or the fabric or the print just doesn't suit you. Or maybe the design of the garment, you've tried it out, but it just doesn't work with your personal style or your lifestyle. And yes, when you can, I think that it's a good idea to try to rework these things and get them to work for you in some way, but that is just not always possible. And sometimes, especially for things like changing size, maybe it puts you in a really bad headspace. And I just think that anything that has a really bad impact on your mental health isn't worth keeping around. Sometimes it is just better to take things and rehome them, giving them to friends and family, giving them to a charity shop, recycling them, or even cutting them up for rags. Sometimes all of that is a better alternative than to keep something around, hanging around in your wardrobe, hanging in a basket that you're never going to do anything with, and making you feel guilty. We all make mistakes in our wardrobes, and we're never going to have a 100% success rate, and so you got to do something with these items that don't work for you at some point, and I think that we should stop shaming each other if we make the choice to just rehome them in some way. It is a valid choice at times to rehome something if it's just not working for you. Number 6 might sound familiar to my newbies out there, and that is that you have to follow pattern instructions to the letter. Now, I have a very well-known history of not being able to follow pattern instructions even when I try, so maybe this one doesn't really apply to me, but I think when we were all new, you kind of had that mind frame that the pattern says to do this, so you have to do it that way, and that's just not always the case. Now, this example I have to share with you is about a knitting pattern, but I do think a lot of the same rules apply to sewing. When I was a brand new knitter, my very first sweater that I ever knit, I want to say it was back in 2003 or 2004, I just was very new and I'd never knit a sweater before, and I didn't really know how to alter the garment to fit me. And so when I was reading the pattern instructions and looking at the schematic for how long the sleeves were, I was just feeling like the sleeves were going to be way too long for me, but I didn't really know how to change it or that I could change it. So I just knit according to the directions and finished my sweater, and when I seamed it all up and put it on, and I was living with a roommate at the time, I went out to show my roommate, and her response was, "Cute sweater, but what's with the gorilla arms?" And I was able to dig up a picture that I can show you. It's a really ridiculous looking sweater because the body is very fitted, but the sleeves are extremely long. And that was a case that I just needed to do more research and figure out that I could actually alter the sleeves to make them shorter, because that's what I would have needed to do in order to get that sweater to fit me. And sewing patterns are the same way. You should also keep in mind that patterns are not always mistake-free. Sometimes the pattern itself is wrong. So if you're reading instructions over and over again and they're just not making sense to you, then the pattern might actually be wrong. It might not be you. And then of course, there are always different methods to do things. And so if you like one way better than another, then go ahead and substitute your own way. It doesn't really matter if you get the same result in the end. An example of this is Big Four patterns. For some reason, they went through this phase where they were really into telling you to use multiple pieces of narrow elastic and feeding them through channels, like multiple channels at a time, like 5 channels in a waistband with all these little skinny pieces of elastic. And I hate doing that. I find it so frustrating and I can never get it to come out right. So I have learned if I see instructions that say to use multiple pieces of skinny elastic, I just use a wider elastic that fits in the casing. And then if I want the look of that skinny elastic with the different channels, I just top stitch over the waistband so that it looks like there's different channels. I did that on this pair of shorts that I made last year, and I really feel like from a distance, you can't tell the difference. It looks exactly the same as it would have if I had used all the tiny elastic, but it caused me so much less frustration. So don't be afraid to deviate from the instructions if it's just not making sense to you, or if you think that there's a better way. There probably is. Just do what you want, and if you're happy with the results in the end, that's all that matters. Lie number 7 is that your garments should always be mistake-free. Now, I have to say, I've maybe made a few garments in my lifetime that don't have any mistakes, but it's very, very few and far between. I like to say that I'm a recovering perfectionist because I definitely have those tendencies that if I start trying to make something absolutely perfect, things can quickly get out of hand and I just end up frustrating myself and ripping out the same thing and redoing it over and over and over again. And in order to prevent that, I've sort of instituted this new policy that I give myself a maximum of 3 tries. So let's say I'm setting a sleeve into a garment and you get some puckers and you can kind of rip just that section out and resew it. I give myself basically 2 to 3 chances to get it right. And if I don't have it perfect by the 3rd try, I just have to leave it and let it go. Because in the end, I definitely think we should be focusing on the 3-foot rule. If you can't see the mistake from 3 feet away, then no one is going to notice. And if they are getting so close to point out that you have a pucker in your sleeve, then there's something wrong with them and they need to back off. I have definitely seen other sewists on Instagram and YouTube, and they're always pointing out every teeny tiny little mistake that's not perfect on their garments. And I do agree with the idea of sharing something if it's useful to people and can be helpful to someone else. But in the case of those teeny tiny little mistakes that we all make, I don't even bother pointing those out to people because I just feel like it's pointless. If the underarm seam of my t-shirt isn't perfectly aligned, no one is going to see that, and I don't need to tell everyone that I did that. And if you go to stores and look at ready-to-wear, their seams probably aren't perfectly lined up either. So I think that it's good for everyone's mental health if we just accept that mistakes happen, and that if you can't see it from far away, that no one's going to notice, and we should just let it go. Number 8 is another specific one that's a little bit strange, and that is I have seen people insist that the only correct way to stitch a hem is on the right side of the garment. Now, I'm not talking about using top stitching thread where you're using a different thread in the top than you are in the bobbin. Obviously, you would have to do that on the right side. But when you're just using regular thread, I don't see anything wrong with stitching your hems with the wrong side facing up. Now, yes, when you look at it very closely, you can detect a difference between the bobbin thread showing versus the top thread showing. But again, back to the 3-foot rule, it is such a minute difference and no one is going to be staring at your hems and noticing the difference. And if it causes you less frustration to be able to just stitch it down on the bottom to make sure you're catching it all the way around, rather than having to do it from the top and then maybe having to rip out sections and redo it, then I just say do what's easier. It's another weird one where I don't even understand why people care about this. And if you do care, then you do you. I'm not here to stop you, but I am saying that if you just want to make your life easier and stitch on the wrong side of the hem, I think that's perfectly fine and no one's going to care. And number 9 is one that I feel more that we tell ourselves rather than what other people tell us, and that is that you should only model your makes online if they're picture perfect. I have definitely seen lots of people saying that, oh, I can't share what I make on Instagram or YouTube because my pictures just aren't good enough. Or they'll show their garments but only on a hanger or lying flat on the floor. And if that's all you can do, I'm not saying that that's wrong, but I do think that it's really helpful to see garments modeled on people because everybody is a different size and shape, and it is always helpful to scroll through a hashtag on Instagram and find pictures of people wearing garments that have similar body shapes and sizes to you. And even if the picture is not absolutely 100% beautiful with good lighting and good posing and whatever, just seeing it on a body and seeing how it hangs can be super helpful information to others. So I know it can be super intimidating sometimes to get out your camera. A lot of people just don't like having their face on camera. If you feel that way and you're not comfortable, then just crop your photos so you can't see your face. But I do think that it is very helpful to be able to see garments hanging on a person, even if the pictures are not magazine photo spread worthy. No one's really judging you for that. But I highly encourage you to go ahead and take pictures of the things that you make and share them on social media if that's what you want to do, because I do think that it's helpful to others and I think that it can help you too. Now, I put out a call on Instagram and YouTube, and I asked you guys to share the lies that you think that sewists tell. And I did get quite a few responses. I'm not going to share every single one of them on this video. Some of them were along similar lines. And in some cases, I don't have a lot of things to say about it myself, but I would love it if you would open it up in the comments and let me know what you think about these things that people have to say, and also share your own versions of the lies that you hear sewists tell. So I've got a few different responses along the lines of one of the lies is that sewing is affordable. Now, I do think that sewing can be affordable, but yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I've spent a ton of money over the years on fabrics and patterns, all those tools that I told you that I just put in a drawer and don't use, so it can quickly get out of hand. But I also think that it is possible for sewing to be affordable if you're conscientious about it. Sam from Frugalissima is a really good example of this. If you haven't watched her channel, I will link it down in the description box below. But I totally get what these people are saying, and for me, yeah, sewing is totally not affordable. I spend a lot of money on what I sew. I also got a few responses about cutting layouts and laying things out according to the grain line, that you don't always have to follow those things, and I would mostly agree. I often do not follow the cutting layouts myself. Now, the grain line to me is a little bit iffier. It kind of depends on what we're talking about. I think some people mention that you can often flip the grain line so you're cutting things out on the cross grain, and I would agree with that, even though I hardly ever do that myself. But I don't really think it's a good idea to just lay your pattern pieces out higgledy-piggledy and just cut them on any grain line that you want. I don't think that that's a very good idea. But I don't think that that's what the people were saying either, and so I would mostly agree with that. Let me know what you think in the comments. I also had a few people talking about having to change your needle for every project or after a certain number of hours of sewing. Now, I pretty much 100% agree with this because I'm really bad about doing it myself. I will change my needle in my sewing machine fairly frequently, but when we're talking about my serger, I often do not change the needles in my serger unless I'm actually switching to a project where the fabric type is just totally different. Like most of the time, I'll just have, standard universal needle in my serger, but if I'm switching to knits or if I'm switching to something really, really heavy or really, really light, then I will go ahead and change the needles in my serger. But yeah, otherwise, I might go for maybe a few months without changing the needles in my serger, and I haven't really had any issues. Maybe once or twice when if it's been a really long time that I haven't switched it out, I might start to notice skipping stitches or something, and then I just change the needles and be like, oh, it's time, I need to do that. And then I change them, and then everything's back to normal and it's perfectly fine. So yeah, I would agree for the most part that you probably don't need to change your needles as frequently as all the manuals advise you to do. It's probably there for more like CYA purposes and not so much about actual valid use. A really good one I thought was that stretch patterns are not for beginners. I know that a lot of beginners are scared of making knits, but I 100% agree with this. I think that something like a basic t-shirt is maybe an ideal beginner project. And once you get the hang of how to sew knits, they are so quick and easy. And when you're a beginner, there's nothing like a quick win to make you feel really good and confident in your skills and want to keep going. So I absolutely agree with that one 100%. I got a couple of responses shared by Andra of Andra Makes. She said that you don't always have to use stretch stitches for knits, and I would agree with that, although most of the time I use my serger, so it's not really an issue. But I have definitely made like jackets before out of Ponte, where the jacket is fairly oversized and it doesn't really need to stretch to go over your body, and so I have just used straight stitches for that and had not had any pop stitches or any problems. Then she also shared that it's a myth that you can't use quilting cotton for garments. I would agree with that as well. I think that quilting cotton is really suitable for certain types of garments and maybe not good for others. But for things like a button-up shirt or a shirt dress or like a simple pleated skirt, I think that quilting cotton is great for that, and it comes in so many beautiful prints and colors. So thank you so much to Andra for sharing that one. And then the last response that I wanted to share is that stay stitching is a myth. That one I thought was really interesting because I usually do try to stay stitch myself. I have not done it or forgotten on occasion, and sometimes it's come back to bite me and sometimes it hasn't. I do think that it's really important that if you choose not to stay stitch, that you want to handle your pieces really carefully and not stretch them out. But yeah, I thought that was another interesting one. Let me know in the comments if you guys stay stitch every time, or it just depends, or you just skip it. I would love to hear what you have to say. So if you enjoyed this video, watch this one next about the mistakes that we make when planning our handmade wardrobes.